Praise the Lord, everyone. Brother Roop here. We're doing a book review. I got three books at an antique store, which I think you might find interesting. The first one is History of England by Mccarrolly. And this book was printed in 1848. The book itself doesn't say when it was printed. I had to look it up and find out. But which is, for an older book, it's not uncommon. A lot of times they didn't have the dates in there. They didn't think it was important back then. But this is the History of England from Ascension of James II. And it goes to 1701 when he passes away, and also his successor, William II, passes away. So it kind of covers the reign of the short reign of James II. He was James II in England and Ireland. In Scotland, he was James VII. So a little confusing there. But that was common that era. He only served 3 years because he served in a very, very troubling time. He served when the English Parliament was taking more authority away from the king. James II was the last king of England to think that his reign came from God, and he had total reign over everybody, over everything. And Parliament had issues with that. So he was disposed after 3 years, and he served as exile in France until he died in 1701. But of course, he still had his hand in English politics, even from France, and his son William II, William Orange, and his wife, Queen Mary, took over after he was deposed. And they reigned only 13 years, which was not a long time. William of Orange and Mary, they were first cousins, so they were cousins, which for royal families were common. So this book was printed in 1848, The History of England, from the Ascension of James II until his death in 1701. Thomas Babington Mccarrolly, which was a tremendous scholar. He wrote this in a 5-volume historical set, and I have volume 5. So his earlier books in the same set, goes way before the Ascension of James II. So James II's reign and his politicking after his reign is volume 5. It is an important part of British history because there was a lot of religious strife. The Catholic Church and the Protestants were fighting for control of England. The Protestants would take over. The Church of England, started by Henry VIII, would eventually reign supreme, and they still do today. So this book was actually printed in New York. So here's the index is quite detailed. Each chapter is not really that long, 1 or 2 pages long, but he has lots of them. And so, quite detailed index here. And as you can see, the pages are quite yellow, and that's because they put sulfuric acid to whiten the paper. Did a great job in whitening the paper, but unfortunately over time the acid makes the paper very brittle, easy to rip, and yellows the pages over time, which it's not a good thing. Today they use bleach to whiten the paper. And paper bleached by, whitened by bleach will stay good for a long, long time, much longer. So, and this book has a very, very detailed index in the back. So, for someone, a historian like me, I kind of like that. So, 1848. Now, here's an interesting set of books on sexuality, printed 120, 130 years ago. These books were printed in 1901. This one's 1905, so its entire set, it's probably like a dozen books. I didn't really count them, but it's like a dozen books together. I found 2 of the set. Of course, there's a bunch more out there, but it's interesting reading about what people thought about sexuality in the turn of the 20th century. And the set is called Commendations from Eminent Men and Women. It's what a young boy ought to know about sex. And it's commended by different scholars and authors of the day. I'm familiar with these authors. They lived a long time ago. But all these people either commented in the book or gave advice or information. Again, what a young boy ought to know about sex. And of course, there's some women in there too who gave their 2 cents. So, of course. Here's the author. Author has a very nice portrait in the book. And as you can see, the pages are yellowing here too. Of course, they use sulfuric acid. To whiten the pages. And as you can see, the price was $1 in 1905. So $1 in 1905 was actually quite a sum. That was quite a sum back then. So what a young boy ought to know about sex. And we know about sex because Sex in Sex Series is the name of the series. Purity and Truth. Purity and Truth. Amen. So the author writes, it's kind of blurry, but the author of What a Young Man Ought to Know, etc., 5-minute object sermons to children, talks to the king's children, etc. And Socrates, got a little quote from Socrates here. Ignorance is vice. I agree with that. If you're ignorant, it's your own fault. So, anyway, it says it's copyrighted 1905 by Sylvanus Stall, the author. And he's an Englishman. And most books were written by English gentlemen and women back in those days. So, interesting book. It's very fragile, so I'll have to be careful with it. But little 5-minute sermons to children about sexuality should be interesting to see what people were thinking about sex 120, 130 years ago. And here's the second one of the series, a Self and Sex series, Purity and Truth. This one was printed in 1901. This is what a man of 45 ought to know. What a man of 45 ought to know. And, of course, different scholars here contribute to the book. Gives their portraits, which I think is nice. I like that they gave their portraits. You can actually see what they look like. And here's the whole series. What a young boy ought to know, what a young man ought to know, what a young husband ought to know, what a young man, well, man of 45 ought to know. So it looks like I got the first and fourth book of the series. And then you got what a young girl ought to know, what a young woman ought to know, what a young wife ought to know, and what a woman of 45 ought to know. And of course, here's the author, same guy. Sylvia Stahl, D.D. That means Doctor in Divinity. And here it says copyright 1901. Of course, England. That's where he's from. So, should be fun to read this book. I'll have to be very careful with all three. They're in fragile condition. But it's going to be great books. Thank you, and God bless you.